Perfect. So let's move on to the next. So I just wanted to give a brief overview of our time today. I'm going to talk a little bit about our shared space. I'll share some guidelines that we've established as a collaborative for how we'll share the virtual space in a way that is aligned with our values and Indigenous ways of knowing. Then we'll have some time for some intros and connections. You'll have the opportunity to connect in a short breakout session. Alina will share an overview of Red Star International's focus areas and foundational values that will then lead into today's presentation, a global Indigenous collaborative. Then we'll have a short question and answer reminder that you can drop questions at any time into the chat. And if you would like to remain anonymous, you can chat directly to Chris Rhodes. Then we'll have our next steps and closing. This will include upcoming dates, a short evaluation, and a closing prayer. Today's webinar is part of the Restoring Balance Collaborative, bringing place into the virtual space. Alina Callway will be sharing the origins of the work of the collaborative in her upcoming presentation. This is a photo taken on Mauna Kea when our advisory council and other stakeholders were hosted by Julio Apa'a. Our advisory council includes leaders across the US, Canada, and New Zealand, representing various organizations whose missions and values align with restoring balance for the well-being of humanity and the environment. Pause so you can read through those. And then here's a photo so you can put faces to the names. This photo was taken in Phoenix, Arizona after our Sacred Waters gathering in February of this year. We are so grateful for their wisdom and guidance as we build this collaborative. Creating a shared space. So if you've attended one of our Restoring Balance webinars, you've heard us talk about bringing place into the virtual space. And really the importance of ensuring that in that space, everyone feels a sense of belonging that we're creating together. And to do this, we've created these sort of agreements and guidelines for our time together. So one, based on egalitarian principles, that we are all inherently worthy and equal. Everyone's voice is valued. No one's voice carries more weight in this space. Two, because we have limited time together, we want to be thoughtful with our words and ensure that others also have time to share. With that said, you'll notice that we will mute you while we're presenting, and that's just to limit background noise. But reminder that you can drop questions at any time into the chat. Three, in this space, we're cultivating a space with open hearts and minds and listening for understanding. Four, the virtual space is innately distracting. Too many windows open, emails coming in. We invite you to maybe close some windows and silence notifications when possible. And we invite you to come into this space as if we were walking into an actual meeting room, finding your seat, getting comfortable, having your water or snacks. Five, this is a space of mutual respect and confidentiality. We will not share any information without your permission. And last, I always like to add one that you do not see on your screen, and that is to embrace the awkwardness of the virtual space. We may talk over each other at times. We may be late to catching a chat, but we'll just pause, we'll reset, and we'll move forward. So in fostering relationships is key to creating a collaborative. And so we like to provide time and space for connection. You will each have 1 minute to introduce yourselves. And if it's helpful, you can select a timekeeper, or maybe you just want to pick up your phone and time yourself. Remember that if you go over your 1 minute, it takes away time for others. So please just be conscious of your time. And I always like to offer a pro tip, because sometimes when we go out to breakouts, nobody wants to be first or nobody wants to be rude and take the lead. So my pro tip to you all is maybe go in alphabetical order by first or last name. And Chris will be prompting us with the breakouts. Welcome back, and we hope everyone had a chance to connect and introduce yourselves. How did that go for everyone? Can we get a thumbs up or an emoji? All right, okay. Ooh, love that rainbow. Awesome. All right, well, we are ready to move into our presentation. Oops, here we go. Alina is a national leader and advocate in Indigenous wellness with more than 25 years of experience working in partnership with Indigenous nations, organizations, and communities to transform ideas into action. She's an enrolled member of the Texas Band of Yaqui Indians and has a master's degree in public health, community health practice from the University of Arizona and a bachelor's degree in education. Alina resides on her husband's traditional homeland of Tauranga Moana, Aotearoa, New Zealand. Please help me welcome Alina.
Thank you, Teresa, for the introduction. And I also want to thank Frank for providing us with a prayer and an opening for our time together in a good way. Greetings to everyone. I hope you're all happy and well. Thank you so much for joining us today and for taking time to learn more about our work. I thought I'd start by sharing a bit more about Red Star, as I know some of you may be new to us. We are a small Indigenous-led nonprofit organization whose mission is to advance Indigenous self-determination for the well-being of humanity and the environment. And we do this across 3 focus areas. Our health systems transformation work is where we got our start and continue to work with tribes and Pacific Island territories in the US to strengthen tribal public health authority and capacity to protect and promote community wellness. In our Restoring Balance work, we serve as a coordinating body and convener to create spaces like this for idea exchange and for advancing Indigenous-led efforts to meaningfully address community health and critical responses to ecosystems under threat. And then our new traditions is our local work here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and is led by Frank, who's provided our prayer today. Frank is a voyager and longtime sailing practitioner, and our work with communities around the canoe aims to promote traditional sailing knowledges and practices, build leadership, and foster connections to the natural environment. So we are based in the US with an office in Aotearoa and have been working with Indigenous nations and organizations since 2007. The foundation of all of our work is the recognition of our inherent sovereignty as Indigenous peoples. And in this sense, the word sovereignty is referring to our right to self-govern, the right to self-determination, and the right to protect, steward, and care for our ancestral lands, traditional territories, and country. Respecting Indigenous peoples' rights to determine their future is one of our organizational values and serves as a beacon for all our decision-making and how we work in partnerships with communities. In 2021, Red Star launched an 18-month exploration into the potential role a global multi-sector Indigenous collaborative could have in addressing climate change as a worldwide health challenge. With support from a grant from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, we designed a participatory process using our framework for transformation that is based on building relationships as the foundation to identifying a shared intent for collective action. We always approach our work from a practice-based place, and we look for connections to what can be learned from research and translated into action. So we had partnered with the 7 Directions, a Center for Indigenous Public Health at the University of Washington, to assist us with a scoping literature review and organizational scan to support this work. And so to determine the value and potential role of a global Indigenous collaborative, we developed a shared learning agenda that explored 3 main questions. What factors support, enable, and reinforce Indigenous knowledge systems? What opportunities exist to support current capacity strengths internationally? And is there value in creating spaces for multi-directional learning amongst Indigenous peoples globally? And our goal was to meaningfully engage Indigenous leaders in the process and to identify pathways to uplift Indigenous self-determination and privilege knowledge systems as foundational elements to both our well-being and environmental resilience. And so we approach this work in the context of social and cultural determinants of Indigenous health and centered it around Indigenous knowledge systems and communities. Due to similar colonial experiences, treaty relations, and common language and health systems, we did focus our initial learning in this work on the US, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, with plans to expand to other regions. And so throughout this process, we convened and engaged in an advisory council and held roundtables to check our assumptions, to make meaning of what we were finding in the literature and trends in the field. We met with individuals one-on-one to speak more deeply about the emerging themes, their recommendations, and to explore opportunities to further align. So what was learned together was then used to develop a plan, which is outlined in a practice brief, and we emailed that out to registrants last week. And I'll just ask Teresa to drop a link in the chat in case anyone missed that brief. So I want to start by talking about how we centered our approach around Indigenous knowledge systems and communities within the context of social and cultural factors that contribute to or hinder Indigenous health and well-being. And so Indigenous identities and knowledge systems in all of their diversity are intricately woven within and across our ancestral lands and waters. They're the means upon which our cultural, physical, and spiritual, and I would say emotional and mental survival depends. Starting with our cosmology, our creation, our emergence and migration narratives, these establish our ancestral relationship with the natural world. And so we see the plants and animals, rivers, mountains as our ancestors, as relatives. And as relatives, there is a respect and responsibility for their care. And that has been passed down to us, and it is in our hands to carry that forward. So these Indigenous knowledge systems also define our relationships within our families, our tribal communities, whether it's by clan systems, so ceremonial or cultural societies or sub-tribes. This also includes our roles and responsibilities and what it means to be a good relative. And in our daily life, Indigenous knowledge systems have always been very practical and had very practical implications in terms of how we live our life ways, all of which have been designed for collective well-being and a thriving natural environment. And so our traditional life ways include our foods and medicines, our traditional games, our healing practices, how we educate our children, our traditional arts, ceremony, and intergenerational relationships. So all of these systems exist within an overarching form of governance guided by customary laws and values that define our processes for decision-making and how decisions are carried out and by whom. And so in our discussions with advisory council members about the importance of Indigenous knowledge systems as it relates to our well-being in the environment, a member shared this reflection about Indigenous knowledge systems being dynamic, excuse me, and ever-changing in terms of how knowledge develops, how it evolves and is applied and transmitted, and also how new technologies are introduced. So what happens when our traditional systems, our ways of life, are systematically dismantled? I think it's important to look to the past to understand our current context. And centuries of forced assimilation policies essentially dismantled many of these systems which kept us healthy, including forced removal in many cases from our traditional homelands and land cessions. This is what it looked like in the US, but I know that other Indigenous communities have faced similar policies. Where education was removed from the home, how we lived was changed from communal living to individual allotments. There have been bans on our traditional practices, disconnections from our homelands, including many of our foods, medicines, and lifeways. And our health and well-being and healing has gone from a way of life to a Western model healthcare system that treats illness. And so contemporary versions of these assimilation policies still exist today. And when we think about what has happened over time to Indigenous peoples through these colonial policies and practices, what happens when there's a similar approach that's taken to dismantling our ecosystems in nature? This is an image of the Colorado River Delta just south of the US-Mexico border. A century of legislation, compacts, court decisions, and regulatory policies have allowed 7 states to legally use more water than is available, putting a chokehold on a water supply that's quickly dwindling. And so states and corporations continue to develop and increase population sizes at a rate that we already know is unsustainable. 30 tribes have historic ties to the river, but until now, they've never been at this decision-making table about its future. And so when we think about and look at the impacts of colonization and the dismantling of traditional systems through the lens of social and cultural determinants of Indigenous health and well-being, it's no wonder that many of our communities experience such significantly higher rates of disease, mortality, and issues that impact quality of life. There are many models that attempt to illustrate these determinants of Indigenous health, but of the ones I've seen, I really like the one pictured here from Margot Greenwood, who shared this model with the National Collaborating Center for Aboriginal Health in Canada. And I like this model because it captures the complexities unique to Indigenous well-being. It is a community-centered model that puts our children, families, cultures, and Indigenous nations at the very heart of wellness. And we are surrounded by communities, nations, and cultures that interface with non-Indigenous structures and systems. And within those interfaces, our communities experience the impacts of colonization, marginalization, and oftentimes dislocation. And so this in turn has an impact, a direct impact on the determinants of health listed here on the left. And this includes our early life, education, employment, and housing. And so understanding these determinants and their interrelatedness with Indigenous knowledge systems is important when we start looking at transforming them. So what we found in our review is that just as colonial practices, systems, and ideologies have negatively impacted Indigenous wellness, there are also significant contributors to the current climate crisis. And what's even more unfortunate is that Indigenous peoples are disproportionately impacted by the climate crisis due to that interconnection of our traditional knowledge systems and practices with ecological systems. So while we remain resilient, there are still systemic and institutional barriers that severely limit Indigenous peoples' ability to sustain and transmit traditional knowledges and practices. Examples of barriers include limited access to traditional territories, restrictive policies and programs, and also limited funding mechanisms to be able to address the unique conditions faced by Indigenous communities. And what our team found interesting about this is that the research has been pointing this for 10 years or more. This isn't new information, but now there is a call to action that's being heard around the world. When we asked community health, when we asked how community health is being impacted by changes in the environment, roundtable participants in our advisory council responded that this isn't new. We've been dealing with these impacts of colonization and capitalism for generations. And so we will continue to use our political will, look to our traditional tribal teachings, and seek to respond to new threats in a way that is aligned with our values. And so Indigenous peoples are in a unique position to positively impact and restore balance. And our political status as sovereign nations and our right to self-determination is critical to determining our future and protecting our way of life. And not just for us, for everyone. And whether it's a global climate crisis or a global pandemic, Indigenous communities continue to demonstrate leadership amid and making headlines for doing what we've always done. And yet many national, regional, and local governments still work to restrict, control, and prevent Indigenous nations from exercising their authority to protect their communities and to respond to public health emergencies and climate crises. So our greatest challenge in conducting our organizational scan to identify current capacity strengths and gaps is how fast everything is changing. With the recent UN Accords on Indigenous peoples and biodiversity, the landscape is quickly changing. But for more than a decade, as I mentioned, the literature has been pointing to the importance of Indigenous engagement and decision-making, and more recently in shared, and inclusive governance with Indigenous nations. Indigenous rights need to be recognized, land tenure, access, and resource rights need to be recognized. There needs to be free, prior, and informed consent, and there needs to be fair and equitable benefit sharing that arises from land use. So Indigenous nations need to be in a position to determine and respond to relevant health risks, vulnerability, and adaptability as they define it. Indigenous-led surveillance and environmental monitoring systems are needed based on community-identified indicators and on local needs to support mitigation and adaptation. And then we need to create and foster authentic intercultural dialogue and exchange that open doors to learning, reconciliation, and the indigenization of sustainable development. And so what we found in the literature, the language itself still tends to keep Indigenous peoples in a secondary position where someone or some other entity is leading or doing the including. And so it's really important that we recognize and reframe this engagement or inclusivity language to Indigenous-led. Our communities know the way forward, and that we need to create opportunities to lead the way. Recommendations for addressing the capacity strengths tend to perpetuate the challenges that were cited most often at the interface with non-Indigenous system stakeholders. So there continues to be a power differential between non-Indigenous governments, Western trained scientists, policymakers, and conservation groups when they fail to recognize and uphold sovereign rights of Indigenous communities. There can be a lack of consultation and collaboration that can often permeate these interactions. We also see differences in who and what is funded, with universities and conservation NGOs receiving large grants to engage communities, while Indigenous-led organizations and communities themselves are clamoring after small grants to be able to advance their cause. And finally, dismissiveness can also reinforce the status quo and perpetuate these inequities. So overall, I think we need to be careful because the new emphasis on Indigenous knowledge is important. And while it's opening doors for this important work, it also has the potential to address many of these challenges that I've discussed. But if funding streams continue to put those with power and influence in the driver's seat of this work, then there's the potential to monetize our knowledge and culture with little benefit to our communities. So it's really critical that we deconstruct these systems and practices that reinforce colonialism and perpetuate inequities. So in terms of how we took what we learned from the process and engaged in and built relationships with Indigenous community organizations, what did we learn in terms of what the potential role for a collaborative could be? And when we were going through this process, we've been using the term critical shifts and asking what critical shifts can we make as a collective. And what we heard was that coming together as a global community was essentially uplifting Indigenous agency at the local level, and that the collaborative could continue to do that by creating a space for Indigenous nations, organizations, and communities to learn from each other as a practice community, by facilitating multi-directional learning with allies, as we're doing today, and by fostering global connections to highlight practical examples of Indigenous-led systems change that are occurring across the Pacific. Coming together to share, learn, and strategize strengthens our Indigenous communities locally for global impact. So even though our local contexts might be different, Indigenous peoples often have a shared understanding, value system, and worldview. And so conversations centered on exploring ideas take our conversations to the next level and lead to cultural innovation. So by convening an Indigenous-led space for learning, sharing, and strategizing, we have the opportunity to connect people who might not otherwise have the opportunity to interact. We can introduce collaborative processes to encourage the free flow of ideas and exchange. We can create collaborative partnerships to address shared aspiration, and also leverage resources, training, and materials to take our work to the next level. And when we asked the question about whether there is value in coming together, we were met with a resounding yes. There is value in coming together to learn from one another and to have a platform for ongoing communication and resource sharing. Others shared that coming together provides a source of inspiration and learning new approaches because the way we all learn is similar, which creates ease, and it also helps strengthen and encourage us when we are dealing with similar challenges. And so in this way, we are approaching the work, the way we were approaching the work was appreciated, with one participant sharing that we know that well-being and sustainability are connected, but they're not always discussed as one. So keeping these connections is really important. So we mentioned earlier that Indigenous knowledge systems are locally based. And so given that, their impact manifests regionally and become globally relevant. And so a goal of the collaborative is to create a space for Indigenous people who are working on the ground, addressing environmental challenges that are impacting health, who are working towards systems change within their region, area, or nation, and who are wanting to connect, grow, and share and collaborate with others globally. And so building local capacity by creating a practice community for Indigenous nations and communities provides that opportunity for learning and strategizing together. So as a collaborative, we're really looking at creating a shared space or a hub for people with common context to communicate and share information, history, stories, and personal experiences. And when we do that, we are building that understanding and insight that can be applied in our different homelands. The second area, multi-directional learning. This is where we have the opportunity to increase awareness, resources, and investment in fostering inclusivity of Indigenous knowledge systems as they relate to climate change. And convening Indigenous-led spaces can shift power dynamics and facilitate opportunities to create ethical space for engagement with non-Indigenous communities and governments within an Indigenous context, worldview, and values. And so looking back to Greenwood's model for social and cultural determinants of health that I showed earlier, it incorporated that interface between Indigenous and non-Indigenous systems. And while we talked about it earlier in terms of the challenges that exist in that space, there is also an opportunity for reconciliation. And she points here to this ethical space of engagement, which is a term first coined by Dr. Willie Ermine, from a Cree elder and retired assistant professor from First Nations University of Canada. And ethical space of engagement with non-Indigenous communities within an Indigenous context, worldview, and values allows for that authentic intercultural dialogue and exchange. And it opens doors to learning, reconciliation, and the indigenization of sustainable development. So when we create spaces for multi-directional learning, we create the opportunity to engage, listen to understand, and reconcile our differences in order to cooperate and to move forward. And the third area that the collaborative will focus on is to actively seek opportunities to amplify and normalize Indigenous voices, worldview, and perspectives at the intersection of health, the environment, and climate. We are in the process of developing a comprehensive communication strategy to bring global attention to Indigenous-led approaches to natural resource stewardship, protection, and management. And so by providing a global platform to highlight local Indigenous-led systems change, we aim to raise awareness and increase representation of Indigenous perspectives on the topics, and again, to reinforce Indigenous worldviews and values, focusing on intergenerational impact. So we held as a collaborator our first global event last February at a meeting of Sacred Waters in Phoenix, Arizona. The 2023 event was based on our first meeting of Sacred Waters, which we held in 2021 as part of a unique partnership between Red Star, the Intertribal Council of Arizona in the US, and the Potupua, the human face and voice of the Awatupua, or the Wanganui River in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And so at that event in 2021, we brought Indigenous leaders from Arizona and New Zealand together for a meeting of Sacred Waters. And this was intended to be an in-person meeting, but because of the pandemic, we moved into the virtual space, which allowed us to create this global platform for them to share their experiences with others and to dialogue about the health and healing of our rivers. And so at our 2023 event, we expanded the conversation beyond the Colorado and Wanganui rivers to include all ancestral waters globally. And so these are the Indigenous leaders we had invited to help us achieve our purpose. And we were delivered including elder and youth perspectives, freshwater and ocean perspectives. And we wanted to reinforce this idea that we are all related and that we are all connected by water. And we had nearly 200 attendees. Again, most of them were in person, but we also were able to offer it virtually and had a strong online presence. And more than 44 Indigenous nations were represented at the event. And so by coming together as an international community in support of our ancestral waters, we were able to highlight practical examples of law, policy, economics, and management practices that are centered on Indigenous values and practices. And so what I'd like to do is just to share a short video with highlights from a meeting of Sacred Waters in 2023 that features some of the perspectives of our advisory council members and others. And then after the video, I will wrap up my presentation. And so if you have questions, now is a good time if you'd like to drop those into the chat. And again, if you haven't already, and again, you also have the options to send your questions or comments directly to Chris, and she'll be moderating our Q&A segment. So I'm going to pause there.
That was beautiful. I see some emojis.
Sorry, I've been talking and didn't realize I was muted. But just coming together as a global community has power. And I know a number of you who are with us today had attended this event. And we all experienced how positive connectivity has power. And in this way, we can support each other and normalize conversations around Indigenous leadership. And engagement is not enough. We also need to be, we need spaces, we need conversations that are led by us. And so I'll close with this quote from one of our advisory council members. Again, now is the time to deconstruct the systems and practices that reinforce colonialism and perpetuate the inequities. And our systems, not just all systems, all knowledge systems are a reflection of our values. And if we really envision an abundant future that is equitable and sustainable, then we have to work together to realign our systems to restore balance. And so I just want to thank you again for joining us today and for taking time to learn more about our work to restore balance for the well-being of humanity and the environment.
Thank you, Alina. That was incredible. It's been such a journey to see the Restoring Balance come together. And it's nice to see everybody on the call today. And it looks like we have some questions in the chat, along with a couple that are have been from folks that maybe are a little bit shy. but I'd like to start out with Coco's chat. That is Coco's question, which is in the chat. Her question is, what do we do in our home communities that connect us through our waterways, protecting our traditional medicines focused on healing and prevention? How
Well,
does
I
the
think that,
collaborative- Sorry.
yeah, and I think these are the questions that are coming to the collaborative, into these spaces where people are working towards different aspects of what it means to care for the land, medicines, foods, waterways, mountains, and even in looking for sustainable practices for agriculture, all of these things. And so being able to create space for those questions and conversations becomes really important. And I think what we've also found is, while one person might be working in one area, like around food sovereignty or traditional medicines, they can still learn from somebody who's sharing what they're doing around the management of their coastal areas. And so being able to create spaces for that type of knowledge exchange is what our goal is, to be able to answer those questions within that learning community.
Thank you. There are a couple of questions around the ethical spaces, and ethical spaces, is something that anytime you mention it, people are very interested. How does that process start, or what does that look like for communities? Can you share some examples from folks in the collaborative that have grappled with that?
Well, I think that this is something that we're all learning about as well. And what we've learned is that even as we've been bringing folks together and talking about the values that guide this convening, even with this webinar, and talking about what those expectations are as we come together of respect and mutual accountability and responsibility, that this space isn't just our responsibility as conveners, but that once we make the decision to cross the virtual threshold and be together, that we all have a responsibility. And so by creating ethical spaces, we're essentially leading the way to say, these are the values and principles that are guiding this convening. And then from there, depending on what the goals and objectives are, it has to be a space that is maintained. But it's all of our responsibilities and not just the responsibilities of one. And so we are looking at how, there's the individuals I mentioned in the presentation, Willie Ermine, you heard from Dr. Reg Croshu at our Sacred Waters, who are the leaders in developing this concept. And we've been seeing reports coming out of Canada of how it's being applied and over time, which is where it really has an impact. And so we're hoping, as we learn more about it, how can we help others learn more about it as well? Because I think we're all looking to foster those kinds of conversations in a way that is conducive to dialogue, reconciliation, but also to identifying solutions where we can cooperate and work together for the benefit of all.
Thank you. That's really helpful. There's one that also came in directly about tribal silos, and how to, when you're working in a community, in our home communities, oftentimes we're not communicating across, or we may be interested in this work, but the public health folks are not talking environment, and environmental health folks are not talking to public health. Has that been something that's come up in the collaborative?
Yeah, well, actually, that comes up in our work probably across our different focus areas, and just thinking of some other work that we're doing directly with a specific tribe that's looking to create collaboration across multiple sectors. And I think what happens, we use a model of engagement for all of our transformation work that starts with the importance of building relationships and identifying common ground. And so oftentimes we enter these spaces with assumptions or an idea of where we want to go, when there's, without creating opportunities to actually ask questions and to create space for letting everyone share their different perspectives on where they'd like to go. And when we can come into spaces by asking questions about what people value, what they would like to see, and be able to hear across the different sectors or silos, and try to drop our assumptions and again, listen to understand is something that we say a lot in our work, then there's the opportunity to find that thread that ties us all together. And I was sharing in a conversation just yesterday, when I was working for my tribe, I had the hard lesson of that I felt that I took away was that I think we all want this, many of us, we want the same things, but we have different ideas about how to get there. And it's reconciling that can be the challenge. And so just like with building this collaborative, we went in, we didn't assume that the collaborative was desirable. We didn't assume that the collaborative would be of value or what role it could serve to communities. We came in, we had ideas, we had assumptions, we're human, but we came in by asking the question and listening. And so I think that it really is the best place to start.
I love it. And I'd say that's our takeaway message, right?
Yeah.
Is, take that time to listen and build relationships, and you'll be able to go further. I just got looking at the clock. We are out of time. Sorry, that Q&A session went faster than we thought. I'm going to turn it back over to you, Teresa.
Awesome. Thanks so much. I'm going to share my screen here, make sure I have it up correctly. Can everyone see that? Awesome. So yeah, that went really quickly. And if you have questions, feel free to reach out and join our mailing list where you can receive updates from Red Star. We wanted to call your attention to our next webinar, which will be in August, where we'll be talking about engaging our Indigenous youth and ancestral natural resource stewardship. So please save that date. And also, very exciting, just coming off seeing that beautiful video of the Sacred Waters gathering that we just had in February, and now we're already planning for the next Sacred Waters gathering. So please save the dates for March 12th and 13th. At our last event, the feedback that we received, one of the biggest critiques was that one day just wasn't enough time. So as of now, we can say that we plan to hold the gathering in the US, and we'll be announcing the location in the next month or so. And lastly, we always try to do our best to bring presentations that are important to your work, that are collaborative, and we can always, learn from you and always grow and improve. And so I'm going to drop a short link into the chat. This is a short survey where you can give your feedback on today's webinar. And pro tip, if you don't want to fill it out right now, just go ahead and click on it and let it open in another window, and then you can always come back to it. We'll also send this out in a follow-up email. All right, and with that, I will pass it on over to Frank to close us in a good way.